In Chapter 3, we're going to cover occupancy classifications and loads. This is the basic list of occupancy classifications, and each of these has several subcategories as well. The IBC and NFPA have slightly different variances on occupancy classification. In California, generally we are referring to the CBC, which mimics the IBC. Occupancy is determined by risk factors, and the main one that we have to assess is the number of occupants as per the code. So that's where we look into the table in Chapter 10 of the IBC/CBC. The other conditions are going to be alertness, mobility, public spaces that people aren't familiar with, potential for spread of fire, and potential for panic. The assembly classification is for large groups of people gathering in spaces, some of which are obvious, like churches, concert venues, social areas, nightclubs. Some are less obvious, such as the A3 classification, which we often see in office buildings with large break rooms or educational buildings with large classrooms. While the B business classification doesn't have any subcategories, it is important to note that in addition to office, professional, service type areas, it does also include educational facilities above the 12th grade and restaurant facilities that are under 50 occupants. The educational classification covers K-12 facilities, as well as many of the child care, daycare scenarios. The F factory classification covers factories and fabricating manufacturing facilities that are non-hazardous, so that are therefore not classified as a Group H for hazardous. The Group H, or high hazard classification, covers facilities that do have materials that could cause a health hazard or physical hazard. And this is good because there are codes that will protect the users. The mercantile classification covers all kinds of retail stores, including mall stores. Institutional occupancies are for those who are incapacitated or imprisoned, and there are several classifications within the institutional category. The storage classification covers basic storage rooms within facilities as well as warehouses that host non-hazardous materials. The residential classification covers everything from hotels to multifamily and single-family residential housing structures. A utility occupancy classification is typically an accessory or miscellaneous use and might be something like a greenhouse, a carport, or even a private garage. There are some uses that don't quite fit into the categories established in Chapter 3 of the code, and those are covered in detail in Chapter 4 of the IBC or CBC. There are many cases where you may have multiple occupancies or mixed occupancies within a facility, and it is important that we note those as we create occupancy classifications on our plans. These examples provide an incidental use space within the main occupancy, such as a small laundry room in one case and a design center in the other, which are accessory uses. In certain cases, the code may dictate certain protection or separation requirements, such as the wall between spaces needing to be of a certain rating, such as a 1-hour rated wall. It is very common to have mixed occupancy or occupancy classifications within one project, And the important thing is that you note that on your occupancy diagrams and use the correct occupant load factor to show compliance. An area can remain an accessory use as long as the total of that accessory use is less than 10% of the overall area of the building or project. Here we're looking at that diagram again on the left as an incidental use and on the right as an accessory use based on the size of those areas within the entire plan. This example shows a building that has multiple accessory uses. Think of your local Target store, the main and mercantile area, but often they have a Starbucks, a snack bar, a pharmacy, and even now some of them have a store within a store. In this example of mixed occupancies, we might be looking at a shoe store on the left that has a large stockroom in the back as your S1 occupancy classification, and maybe an office or small break room for employees, which would be a B classification, all accessory to the M. The example on the right would be a two-story or could be multi-story mixed-use space where you have restaurant and shops on the ground floor and maybe office space or even residential space above. The mixed occupancy examples may need to be separated by rated partitions, as is the case of the top illustration, where the I-4 is separated with a 2-hour wall from the B, and the bottom illustration is showing a non-separated example. The occupant load involves a mathematical calculation, and you need to know the square footage of the space as well as how the space is being used. You'll refer to table 1004.5 in chapter 10 of the IBC or CBC to determine the occupant load factor that you'll use, divided by the square footage of the space, which will give you the occupant load. The previous code table has examples of gross area as well as net area, and those are the factors determined by the code that would be used to do that math calculation. This illustration is a good example of a mixed-use occupancy where we're looking at a library and the load factor for the stack area is 100, the reading room 50 net, and study room 15 net. Regardless if it's saying gross or net, you're basically taking the size of the space divided by the square footage of the area to determine the occupant load. We generally round up, and you have that total number of occupants for the space coming in at 40. This is an important concept when thinking about egress from spaces. Generally, the code does not allow you to travel through more than one space or intervening room before you reach an exit. And in some cases, those exits must be direct. When it does allow you to exit through another space, it cannot be a kitchen space, a hazardous or locked space, such as a storage room. I'm going to have you look up the code language in the California Building Code yourself to read that code section. These illustrations show us 2 floors of a building, first and second floor, with a variety of occupancy classifications. Each one would then need to be determined by dividing the occupant load factor into the square footage for the space to get an occupant load for each individual unit. These last slides go into the concept of fixed seatings, which you might typically see in a restaurant, bar, or large auditorium space or church. Here are 3 examples that show the exact same floor plan used with 3 different occupancy classifications. Plan A, a movie theater. What would the classification be for a movie theater? Plan B, a church. And Plan C, a restaurant. This one would be harder to classify at this point because we don't have the square footage for that restaurant. Please take a few minutes and answer the following questions that are written in the module to let me know that you've read and understood the concepts from Chapter 3, Occupancy Classifications and Loads.